Hello everybody and a big welcome. I'm Nancy Clark and I've just finished my term as a member of the Committee of the Friends of the National Library. A new committee has just been elected and I know it will continue to provide a wonderful program for you, the Friends. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Some of you, quite a lot of you, are joining us online from other places, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the places where you are. Now, once again, a very warm welcome to what we know is going to be a terrific evening. We're really so pleased to have so many of you attending in the theatre and online. But I need to do that ugly and boring warning. Could you just please check that your phones are off or on silent? Thank you. We heard that. We're here for the craft of historical fiction. Historical fiction is a writing genre that attracts a huge readership, as we can see. It can be scholarly, escapist, reflective, witty, and much more. Tonight we've got an opportunity to explore some aspects of this genre with three experts. Two are practitioners, writers. Both have published widely in other genres as well, but it's their historical novels we're concentrating on. They're over there. Alison Goodman, Alison? Alison Goodman's two Ill-Mannered Ladies novels have had huge success. Set in the Regency period in England, they're fast-paced, witty and dynamic, with Gothic overtones. Our heroines, Lady Augusta, Gus, and her sister Julia, race from one implausible adventure to the next, along the way addressing issues very topical today, including domestic violence and sexual and social exploitation. It's great news that the most recent, The Lady's Road Guide to Utter Ruin, has just been announced on the nomination list for the Dublin Literary Award for 2026. Sue Williams' three Australian novels, set in the very early days of English settlement in New South Wales, focus on historical figures often overlooked. The wife, the daughter, the mistress of the men traditionally portrayed as significant in our colonial history. Many of us already knew about or something of Elizabeth MacArthur, the clever wife of landowner and bully John MacArthur. But it's thanks to Sue that we now know also Elizabeth Macquarie, Mary Bligh, Anne Innitt and Anna Josepha King, along with other early colonial women, and we're the better for it. Different in mode and setting, though, these two series of books are. Alison and Sue are both meticulous researchers, which is, I'm sure, is significant for our moderator, Professor Kate Mitchell. Thanks, Kate. Director of the Research School of Humanities and the Arts and Professor of Literary Studies at the ANU. Kate's particularly interested in historical fiction, along with the ethics and the creative possibilities involved in fictionalising past lives and events. Absolutely spot on for this evening. Thanks, Kate. Now, practicalities. Kate will lead the conversation with Alison and Sue for about 35 minutes. Then we have a little surprise, and then some time for questions. Now, if you're attending online and you would like to ask a question, please type them into the comments bar on the screen and press submit. We'll pass them on to the speakers for their response if time permits. After we've done all of that, there'll be an opportunity for you to have your copies of Alison and Sue's books signed upstairs in the foyer. The bookshop is staying open till 7:30. Over to you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for inviting me to come and share a conversation with these wonderful authors beside me here. It's really exciting to be here and to get to learn more about the way you've approached writing about the past. And I thought it might be nice because you're both actually quite prolific writers and have written across a range of different genres, from fantasy and young adult fiction to true crime, biography. And I was wondering a little bit about what drew you to historical fiction, to the past, for your most recent novels.
Well, I guess I've always written non-fiction, but then during COVID, I kind of thought it'd be nice to write something completely and utterly different, something a bit more challenging. And I kept thinking, non-fiction, you end up doing so much research, you're working with living people, and it can be really difficult sometimes to say exactly what they're like when they really don't want anybody else to know. It becomes a real juggling act, because obviously you don't want to make books a hagiography if you're writing a biography. You kind of have to have the stuff, the skeletons in the cupboard as well, and sometimes that doesn't go down too well.
We're all thinking
really
about,
difficult.
Who has she written about again?
Well, all the skeletons are there to be, seen, really. So I kind of thought fiction must be so much easier. Famous last words. And I've always loved historical fiction, Philippa Gregory, Hilary Mantel, and I thought, how hard can it possibly be? And now I know it is so hard. And the first book, Elizabeth and Elizabeth, about MacArthur and Macquarie, ended up taking me 5 years, whereas normally a book might take 6 months. Yeah. So I found it absolutely horrific, and I thought, I'm never, ever going to write another one of those again. But then it did really well. The publisher said, we'd like another one, and then another one. And now I'm absolutely in love with it, because it was wonderful delving back into the past. I mean, we both love doing research and discovering what people's lives were like then, especially the women, because they were usually overshadowed by the men, because the men had the positions of power, and often the men wrote the history books as well. So they kind of they didn't really take much notice of the women. So it was just lovely to bring these women out into the light. And you get absolutely lost in that time period. And it's just a really fabulous feeling to be there and to be kind of watching your characters working together. And obviously it's a very foreign place, the past. And it's hard for a 21st century or 20th century woman to appreciate what it was like in the 18th century or 19th century. So there are huge limitations, but it's just a wonderful thing to be able to educate people sometimes and entertain them at the same time. And that's what I love about historical fiction.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I think my introduction came when I was about 12, and my mother gave me my first Georgette Hare book. Yes, These Old Shades. A good introduction. Under the sheets with the torch. It was wonderful. And that sort of started my love of the 18th century and early 19th century. Definitely read all of Georgette Hare's oeuvre, and then moved on to Jane Austen and Brontes and all of that beautiful literature. So when I was writing my own fiction, I started through science fiction and fantasy, which are not as far from historical fiction as you'd think, because they're both very much involved about creating world. And whereas one is maybe a futuristic world, the history is the past world. And I was working on a vampire novel. That's right. I was working on a vampire novel. And then suddenly this book came out. It was all about sparkly vampires, which was Twilight. And it's kind of like, all right, never got to write a vampire novel. That's not going to get published. So I was left with a whole lot of sort of thinking about a book, but without kind of where I was going to go with it. And I went to the Romance Writers of Australia conference, an excellent conference, a lot of craft-based information. And Jennifer Closter, who's written Georgette Heye's biography, was doing a session on researching the Regency. Now, I'd always thought, because I've come through professional writing degree and I've done my master's in professional writing and also my doctorate, so I've always gone through the craft of the fiction. I'm not a historian, but I don't have the research skills for the Regency, which is a beloved era. There are websites devoted, you probably know this, websites devoted to picking holes in Regency novels. So I thought, well, this is a very kind of intense research period to do, even though I love it. But Jennifer was talking about how there's so many extant resources now available. The online resources are fantastic. And I girded my loins and I decided I would write in that era. And that's what started me off into going into first historical fantasy, which is the Lady Helen series, and then the Ill-Mannered Lady series.
Actually, you've both just sort of touched on something that I was quite interested in terms of what was sort of different in the writing process for you. Was it a different kind of process when you sort of turned to the past for those stories or for the inspiration for the story? You were saying that it's there are similarities in that world-making similarities between fantasy and historical fiction, but were there differences as well?
I think, one of the main differences, I think, is if you're melding in real people and real kind of historical figures. And there is a decision, I think, that historical fiction authors have to make, whether it's conscious or unconscious. It's the level of authenticity and accuracy, and I split those in apart from each other. The accuracy being the historical facts as we know them or as we have received them, and the authenticity of how it feels, what we think that world would feel like as we walk through it in fiction. And the historical fiction author needs to decide, where am I going to pitch my authenticity and my accuracy? And we've seen with things like Bridgerton, which is great fun, and it's got a contract immediately with its viewers, which is, we're not going to be very authentic and we're not going to be very accurate, but we're going to have fun. And that's great. They pitch it and they tell you, and most historical authors need to make that decision.
Yeah, because, I mean, as you will all know, there's a huge range of historical fiction. It goes from people who are really careful with the facts, but just weave fiction in between the known facts and try and bring them to life and add some flesh and blood and emotion and motivation into the story so that we can empathise with the people, because that's what we really want to do. We want to draw people into the story so we feel them and see them as real characters. And there are other people at the other end of the spectrum who might be writing about real people, but they'll give them a different name, so then they can do anything they want to with that person. They can take a lover, they can have an illegitimate child, they can do anything. And it's just a massive range, and I kind of sometimes get a bit frustrated with the people at the other end, because I'm reading a book and I'm thinking, who is this based on? Why are they doing this now? And then you kind of have to keep going back to try and work out who they're actually talking about, and I find that enormously frustrating. But it's just a massive range, because some people will love playing with historical figures, and some people will like the truth about those historical figures to remain true. We had Kate Grenville, who in Room of Leaves had Elizabeth MacArthur having a lover, and a lot of people were absolutely outraged at that, me included. And so you kind of, you have to, as you say, pitch where you want to be on that spectrum, really, because people will often come up to you and say, did they really do that? Did they really say that? Well, you have to know your ground to be able to stand your ground and say, yes, that was perfectly true. Obviously, the conversation was made up, but their feelings were absolutely right.
So in terms then of, we've lost the slide, but the governor, his wife and his mistress, how did you sort of approach what was in the historical archive and what you obviously needed to add? Because I imagine that there's a very sort of different amounts of information and different kinds of information perhaps available about, you know, Governor King versus his wife, probably still a bit legitimate, might find a way in, and the convict mistress.
Absolutely. Well, Philip Gidley King, as we all know, was the third governor of New South Wales, and he was quite exceptional in that he had a mistress and then a wife as well. And that is what drew me to the story. I mean, it's great being able to talk about what Gidley King achieved and what the period was like, because he came over on the First Fleet with Arthur Phillip and he went through enormous trauma along the way. But that one event really attracted me. I really wanted to find out a lot more about that, really. And I kind of really... I mean, the difficulty is you kind of have to have characters who are a bit sympathetic because you want to travel with them through the journey. And Philip Gidley King, betraying his mistress so brutally, he could have been a really nasty person, but I decided to choose to make him just a bit hopeless, really, a bit hopeless with women. He was a good governor, but it's just he had no idea with women. And his convict mistress, where he was on Norfolk Island with her, there were lots of... history written about them, and Philip Gidley King was meticulous about writing a journal every single day. But the truth lies somewhere between the lines. Like, in one diary entry, he wrote one journal entry, which was being sent to the king all the time, whenever a ship came by, said that a child was born on Norfolk Island and was the first child to be born. He didn't mention it was his child, or it was his child with his mistress, or that the child had a really interesting name, Norfolk. Really unimaginative. Yeah. So you kind of have to then start reading between the lines and trying to work out what has been left out, really. And so you've got lots of sources, but sometimes we don't really know too much about... We know a little bit about how the mistress and the wife got on. I mean, the mistress... Gidley King went back to England to report on the progress of the colony to the king, and his mistress said, "You will come back to me, you know, you've got Norfolk here and I'm having another baby, so you'll have 2 children." And he said, "Yes, I'll come back." And of course he did come back 2 years later, but with a new wife in tow. And you think that's, you know, real Madame Butterfly stuff, really. It's just horrendous. How would that situation have played out? Yeah. And we know a little bit about how it played out, but putting in the emotion there and the drama is, to me, what really sort of strikes a chord, and hopefully with readers too.
And your main characters, Alison, are made-up characters, but then throughout the Ill-Mannered Ladies novels, you do have a range of historical people. Beau Brummel becomes a kind of operative or secret agent figure. I don't think I'm giving anything too away too much there. How did you... So Beau Brummel, the ladies of... Oh, I've picked the wrong one to try to say. The ladies of Llangollen. The Welsh ladies. There's a range of historical figures. So did you find that there was a different way that you needed to approach including those, real world historical figures to sort of incorporate them in? Or what kind of, what relationship do they have to the rest of the story?
Of the way that I build the story. Well, Gus and Julia, the twin sisters, they're 42-year-old spinster twin sisters. That gives them, and they've got a standing in society which gives them ability to meet these people. And so when I'm building the historical events around them, I do obviously do due diligence. I research the people that I'm going to include. Now, with Beau Brummel, what I saw was a gap. A gap in the kind of information that I was getting, whereas there's this man who was so close to the Prince Regent. I thought, well, there's a gap, there's a kind of little space there that I could say, well, would he be feeding information about this very volatile royal to someone who would be interested, being the government? So that's where I did deviate from what is known. And whenever I do that, I do write an author's note because it's not there. It's not in the history. But when I was creating the ladies of, I think it's pronounced, and this is terrible, I'm going to do it incorrectly. Sorry for the Welsh people in the audience.
Yes, me too.
No, that's not going to happen. There's a lot of...
I did it. Llangollen.
Llangollen, I think it is, something like that. An interesting same-sex couple, and their whole kind of way that they lived their life was so kind of interesting for that time. I love that they ran away together first, both dressed as men with a rifle and a dog, as you do. Brought back by their families who were quite horrified, and then eventually their devotion to each other won over to a certain degree. The objections, and they moved to Wales to live together. So there's a lot of research about that. And I do a particular kind of research as well, which I wrote my PhD on, which was going to the place that you're setting your historical fiction and walking the ground. And so that's about feeling that kind of space and working out what kind of opportunities are there for the fiction. So I was doing a lot of that in my research as well, especially around trying to fit these people into how my heroines were moving around and having their adventures.
So they sort of, I mean, one of the things that I think I was thinking about as I was reading it is they also sort of anchor your heroines in their sort of historical context a bit and sort of pull them into it. Because Gus and Julia do some things that we might find surprising if a lot of what we know about the Regency period is given to us through Jane Austen or Austen adaptations or even Georgette Heyer. They're sort of, they're quite independent. How would you describe those main characters?
Well, they're kind of, they're using their privilege to help other women in peril. So they've got, Gus has kind of had it with not having no purpose other than going to parties and doing all that kind of stuff, and she wanted some purpose in life, and I think it is interesting because the Regency that we're given often is a very clean white Regency, and it was appalling. It was an appallingly unclean, unhygienic, diverse place. And that's the Regency that Julia and Gus moved through, and one that was very, very violent. So yeah.
And we did get sort of, shadows of that around the edges of Austen's novels. I mean, there's a duel that kind of happens off stage in Sense and Sensibility, and I think one of the other things I was thinking about with the women that you've created is that, we can sort of lose touch today, I think, with just how shocking Austen's heroines were. That, I mean, Elizabeth, when she rejects Darcy, it's a shocking, and quite irresponsible, actually, is the other way to think about that. And so I was thinking with both of your novels, I think it's interesting the way that you've represented the women. Both novels, of course, are set in the early 19th century and late 18th century, so in a similar time period, partly in England, partly in Australia, or entirely in England. I was wondering what sort of role, and I think, Sue, you touched on this in what you said at the start, what kind of role historical fiction can play in bringing out these sort of both women's voices, but also maybe fleshing out a picture of what women may have been like then, which might not entirely fit the sort of ideas that we carry around with us all the time.
Well, I guess it was easier with Australia because many of these women came over as convicts and they had really shocking beginnings. It was really tough. I mean, Anne Inett, the heroine of The Governor, or the mistress, she stole a dress. She was a seamstress, but she stole a dress, and we think it was probably from a woman who hadn't paid her bill. But she went to court and she wasn't allowed to say anything in her own defence. She was told afterwards that she was only allowed to put in a written plea. She had no idea. She couldn't write. I mean, you know, these women had no rights whatsoever. And then you get shoved in prison for 16 months, then you get sent onto a ship, and then you spend 8 months on a ship in the First Fleet, or maybe even, God forbid, the Second Fleet, which was horrendous. So I think what I really wanted to bring out very much was how resilient these women were. And yeah, the nice, lovely Regency period, I mean, for these women, it was just hell, really. It was just hell on earth. And even before that, we've got Elizabeth MacArthur, I mean, who's going out and farming when John keeps being sent back to Britain. I mean, it's not so shocking that she went out farming, because her education back in Devon, when she was growing up, her schooling, she was tutored by a vicar, and the schooling also included how to farm, because if your brothers or your father or your husband was away, you had to know how to run a farm. So it wasn't so surprising that she did so incredibly well. But I think in that period of time, I think a lot of us were surprised that she managed so extraordinarily well. And John was writing all these messages back saying, do this. But really, it took 6 months to receive the letter. So by then the issue was she'd had to solve it herself, really. So there were amazing, incredible women. Mary Bligh, she was the only person when the Rum Rebellion happened. We had 300 men marching on Government House with their muskets loaded. She was the only one who went out to meet them at the gate. Everybody else stayed in Government House, and she went out, a tiny little woman. Her husband had just died. She was dressed in mourning black, and she had a parasol, and she tried to strike the men on their chest to send them back. I mean, wow, these women were quite incredible, and yet they've never really received a proper place in history, I think.
Yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, you did. Absolutely. And what about for you with the way that Gus and Julia?
Well, when I was thinking about writing The Ill-Mannered Ladies, I wanted to write women that were older in Regency fiction, because the Regency fiction has a tendency to stop. You know, women stop at about 28. Nothing
when
after
they're
that.
either married or old, well, yes.
And Gus and Julia are 42. And I wanted to, and I also, when I was creating the character of Gus, I wanted her to be able to question the society that she's in, which, of course, because although we've had enormous changes, there are still many things about women's status that haven't changed as much as we'd like, or haven't changed at all. So I created Gus as an apostate. She's lost her faith. And with that, she starts to question all of the so-called God-mandated placements in the world, you know, where women are placed, where everyone has their position and things like that. So she starts to question all of this. And in doing so, starts to actually see the inequalities that's in her society, whereas before she was just kind of living obliviously to them in her sort of higher position. So that's, in that way, Gus and Julia can interact. Gus is an apostate. Julia still has her faith. So there's some friction between the sisters in that sense. So they interact with the underbelly, I suppose, of the Regency world. As Gus goes in full blaze with Julia behind her going, but wait, let's think about this. So that's the twins complement each other, but they are there to look at, as they have their kind of full adventures, they are delving into some of those very dark edges of the Regency world.
And there are some very dark aspects to the novel in that regard, aren't there? Both the novels, there's the resurrectionists, the body snatchers, sexual slavery, the virgin cure, and so on. Were you particularly attracted to this time period because of the kinds of themes then that it allowed you to work with, in terms of what you've just talked about in the way that drawing parallels between today and...
When I was first writing the Regency, which is the Lady Helen novels, which is where I transplanted all that kind of thinking about supernatural into the Regency. We call it Pride and Prejudice meets Buffy. It was what I loved about the Regency for that aspect was that what we have is the rambunctious, bawdy Georgian era smashing into the civility of the Regency era. And so we have this layer of civility, of manners, but underneath is all this kind of seething kind of bawdiness and things that are still going on and still there. And in that kind of dynamic friction, that's where I found the attraction initially for the Lady Helen. Then I thought, that this is, to actually look at it in a way that is straight historical works perhaps even better, because no need for demons. The demons are humans. So that's where I thought, well, there's enough demonic humanity out there to satisfy a historical novel.
And did you have a sort of contemporary reader in mind, Sue, for this sort of story about Australia's colonial past? Or how did you kind of negotiate that balance between that commitment to historical accuracy or authenticity, but also in a way that will resonate with the
Sure. I mean, it's really hard to write about, women or men from a completely different age because we don't really know how they thought. So, it's always going to be a contemporary view of them, really. But we hope we kind of get something of how they feel. Like Anna Josepha, the wife of Gidley King, must have been appalled when she arrived in Sydney. Her husband hadn't told her about his mistress, and suddenly she's met this woman with a baby in her arms and a little toddler. And you kind of think, well, that horror must transcend the ages. It would be different because so many men had affairs with convict women and then just went back to England to their wives, or brought their wives over and said, well, this is my mistress, but she's now our servant. And so it was kind of, everyone was doing it. But at the same time, you kind of think on a human level, it must have been so hard for those women. And I talked to an historian who is a direct descendant of Gidley King, and he wrote a book about Gidley King, and he's very proud of him, quite rightly. But he kind of dismissed Anne Inet in about a line. And I said, well, I think she is much more important, and the fact that, Gidley King behaved in this way, I think needs to be documented. And he said, no, I don't think anyone needs to know that. So it was kind of, it was a clash between us. And he's a lot older than me, and he's obviously got a very distinguished pedigree and very defensive about that. But, I think I want to have my honesty in there. And maybe it's overstated in terms of the age, but we can only judge from our own perspective and from all the research we've done and trying to understand people's the time and the age they were in, really, and their perspective. So we can never be completely 100% right, but we can try our best, really. And hopefully people will emote with the characters and identify with them, and we can kind of go on their journey with them a bit.
And it's really beautiful, actually, the way you describe or portray the sort of eventual friendship between
Sure.
It's Anne and Anna, isn't it? And
That's right.
Anna Josepha.
Everybody's got the same names, Elizabeth, Anne. Yeah, it's really hard. But yeah, I mean, women were nothing if not pragmatic. They were in a really difficult position, and then sometimes, Elizabeth MacArthur, Elizabeth Macquarie, their husbands hated each other. They were on the opposite sides of the political divide. But it made much more sense for them to get on well. Yeah. And it made much more sense for Anna Josepha and Anne Inet to find some kind of accommodation, especially when Gidley King was saying he wanted to take his mistress's children away and wanted to give them to his wife. You know, you kind of have to think about that too, really.
So do you feel a sense of responsibility then when, it must have been, I don't know, interesting but maybe confronting or limiting to meet a descendant of a character or a person that you're fictionalising.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah. And we had a few arguments But it kind of remained civil, really.
Yeah.
And for the launch of the book, Jonathan King came to the launch, and he's a direct descendant of Gidley King and his wife, Anna Josepha. And I managed to track down some descendants of Gidley King and his mistress, Anne Inet. And I thought, I'll get them together at the launch. And I thought, I have no idea how this is going to go. And I was a bit nervous about the whole thing. But in fact, I introduced Jonathan, I introduced the woman, and she was much younger. She was about 17, and she didn't know much about her heritage, but then she'd read the book and she was really interested and excited about it. And I thought they were going to kind of shake hands across it, but they actually hugged each other, which I thought was fantastic.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of descendants of Gidley King, and there's a lot of descendants of his mistress in Australia. And lots of people have written to me and said, and there's a character in there, Olivia Gascoigne, who was on Norfolk Island, she was my great-great-grandmother. And so you really do have a responsibility, because there are lots of living relatives of these people around, and you have to treat them very fairly. And so, I think in real life, nobody's really bad, maybe Putin, I don't know. But nobody's kind of 100% bad. There are people who maybe are 60% bad, but they've got a bit of niceness about them, really. And I think you kind of have to be fair to your characters and give them light and dark as well. And, not just try and whitewash them and pretend they're all fantastic. So, you just have to try and make them real people, I think.
Humans. Alison, I wanted to go back to something that you said about your writing process, which included visiting locations that you were writing about. And I wondered if, I think we're running out of time, but if you would each just say something a little more about your because you've talked a lot about your enjoying the research process and what that process looked like, in terms of what the process was, but what that sort of interplay was between creating a sort of fictional world and undertaking research and moving back and forth maybe between those.
Well, initially when I was writing the Lady Helen series, I did 8 months of a deep kind of dive into the Regency period, which was fantastic. I was reading everything I could, and I got all the Times newspapers from the period that I was working in, and you're doing all those kind of very deep dives. And then I had the chance to go over and walk the ground and where the settings where I was setting each of the books and things like that. So that's sort of pre kind of research that I do. So that gave me a great foundation of that period. So that when I was thinking about my characters walking into a room, say, then I would know at what kind of carpet would be on the floor for that level of society, what kind of candles would be in the sconces. One of the things that I found out was that there were candles that were measured in hours. So when you walked into a ballroom and there was an 8-hour candle in the candelabra, you think, yes. So it was going to be a long one, and very, very sad when it was only a 4-hour candle. So there are things like that where I knew the ins and outs of how you would move through that environment, and then the writing starts, and that's sort of building characters, and just in terms of that question that you just asked before. The way that I create the characters to be able to kind of reach hopefully a contemporary audience, but still stay within the as we have discussed, kind of that limit. We're limited in the way that we can think about the mindset of those people, but we try our best to bridge it. Is that I look for the seeds of modern thought in the time. So abolitionism, and things like the apostate. There was beginning to be thoughts about atheism. Shelley got sent down from university because he wrote a pamphlet about atheism. So those kind of all things come into creating, and then I don't know if you're the same, but then of course there's always gaps in your research. So you're running off here and researching on this thing and then coming back and going off and doing some more research and coming back and slowly building that world as you go along. But I have a foundation first.
So the research began the sort of process.
Yeah, the research began, and then as soon as I got to that comfortable level, where I thought, okay, now I can move through this environment without having to go and research sort of the smaller stuff, then I can move forward into writing the story, and then I'll research, and then I go back and research like the bigger stuff that I need for each particular storyline.
Yeah, great. And
it's kind of easier for me in some ways because I've got a set timeline that's real, and so I will immerse myself in research and then try and work out how I'm going to write the book and which parts of each era I'm going to magnify and which parts I'm just going to kind of skip over because you can't obviously include everything. So you kind of learn as much as you can about the research, and finally you just bury yourself in it, and then finally your publisher phones up and says, "Where's this bloody manuscript?" And you think, "Oh my God, I better start writing," because the research is really pleasant. And I've got a friend who's started lots of books, but he spends all his time doing research because you just go down all the rabbit holes and he never does anything really. So that's a really nice part of the book. But you can end up with so much research, it's completely overwhelming, and you can't see a way through. And I think that's what happened with the first book. That's why I panicked so much. But every single book I panic about, really. I'm panicking about the next book now. You'd think I'd be over that by now. But it happens every time because even in the research, you kind of discover these little things that you never realised. I'm doing a book about MacArthur's 3 daughters for the next book. And his eldest daughter never married. She fell in love twice, but John MacArthur forbade her to marry her lovers. Well, they weren't really lovers, they were suitors. And I discovered just yesterday that she'd been a bridesmaid to one of her friends. And you think, this poor woman ended up a spinster. She never married, broken heart with the first guy, John Oxley, that she wasn't allowed to marry. And then she's a bridesmaid. How hard would that have been? And I mean, for me, that kind of really strikes a chord, and I know that will be a chapter on its own. So that research just throws up diamonds constantly, really.
And do you have a process for working out what's really interesting but needs to be let go of for the novel? Or
Absolutely, because you can end up, you don't want to bore the reader, really. You want the reader to know that you've got a grasp of the research, so they feel confident in your hands, but you can't bombard them with facts. And I think lots of new writers, and myself included at the beginning, you just try and explain everything. You kind of give everything context. And you have this point where you're talking about ships and you're talking about the First Fleet, and I showed my partner my first chapter of a book, and he said, "Look, you're fine, you've got so much information here though. It was going so well before HMS Exposition sailed in." And you think, yes, that's true. So you have to be really careful. You kind of do all the research, you put it in, and then you just strip it out again because you want the story to sing, you want the characters to live. And you can't, otherwise they just get muffled by all the research. You just can't afford that, really. People need to know that you know the period and that there's no problems, there's nothing, people are not going upstairs to bed when there's only one floor, which I've done before.
It's like writer authority. You've got to sort of give that reader the sense that there's an authority there that knows, but not going to be boring about it. So that it's about, I mean, when I'm creating that kind of forward movement, it's about, for me, I'm writing in a first-person narration, so it's through Gus's point of view. So it would be very strange for Gus to actually be explaining her world as if she's never walked through it before. So it's about what is interesting in her at that moment, and that's always attached to the problem that she's solving at the time. So there's a whole kind of stream, sort of jet stream of what's going on. And as she's moving through that world, it's kind of like, well, she's got to find a particular book. She's going to be looking through the books, and so we can get some ideas of what's been published and that kind of thing. So this is the way I drop in the information to make sure that it's always moving forward. Otherwise, you can get bogged down in that kind of in that kind of love of the research.
Absolutely.
Now, I think on that point, I think in your books, Alison, there's a there is that sort of sense of building the world through the detail. You mentioned the carpet and the sconces and, the candles and so on, but also clothing. And I'm wondering whether you have a little treat.
I do have a little treat
for us
I do have a little treat. I do, if I may. So what I've brought, part of my kind of immersing myself in the research was that when I wrote the Lady Helen books and I was quite a bit younger, I thought I would go to events and I would dress in Regency gear, right? Now, I cannot sew at all. My mother is a master embroiderer. She teaches embroidery, and she has a daughter who can't thread a needle. But I thought, well, what I'll do is I actually do what the Regency ladies would do, and I would employ a mantua maker to create my wardrobe for me, who's actually in Canberra, a costumer in Canberra. Yay, Canberra. So I got a wardrobe made, which would probably have been similar to what someone of class of Jane Austen. So genteel, a little bit, not a lot of money, but quite interested in fashion. Jane Austen was quite interested in fashion.
Very interesting.
So I wanted to go through the layers of what a lady would wear. So the first layer that we would have is the chemise. So it's a very simple undergarment with a drawstring. This was, if you kept this clean, so if you changed this every few days, you would consider yourself clean. You may not bathe, but you would consider yourself clean. So that was the first layer. The second layer, I might just come over here, would be your corset. Now, this is a Regency corset. As you can see, it's quite small. And it's about the same level comfort as a modern bra. The sleeves come slightly off the shoulder because the gowns were cut so low. And this area here, ladies and gentlemen, was the real estate. So that was there's quite a bit of a kind of uplift within the corset to show off those. And of course, there were also at that time false breasts if you didn't have quite the uplift one needed. They were made out of wax, so do not stand near the fire. There were some tragedies. So that's and that was always worn over the chemise. So you never had this against skin. So on top of that would be your petticoat. Now, this is a summer petticoat. It's cotton. It has a little bit more fanciness at the bottom. You can see a little bit of tuck work. That would go over. In winter, it might be flannel for warmth. And often they were coloured as well. Dyeing was becoming a big trade for everyone's clothes at that point. And there was a rush to try and find the Turkish red. There was actually a prize to actually find a Turkish red that would hold. No one had it. Until, I think, quite late, when some French dudes worked it out. But that's the petticoat. Now,
let me take it from...
thank you. Now, just as a little side interest, and I think you've got a fabulous story that goes along with these, most ladies did not wear underpants. But there was this option, which was the crotchless. As you can see. There we go. You would tie them on, and as you can see, a little bit of lace at the bottom, and they would go under the very, very sheer muslins that were available at the time, which I'll show you in a minute. But I think you have a wonderful story.
Mary Bligh was very fashion conscious, and her mother would send her clothes over from London, the latest London fashions. And I think her mother felt very embarrassed that poor Mary had to come and accompany her father all the way over here because her mother didn't want to spend 6 months on a ship with her husband, William Bligh, because he's so bad-tempered, really. And so she sent her second eldest daughter over. But Mary was so fashion-conscious, her mother would send her all these clothes all the time. And one time she sent her this very flimsy A-line dress that in the drawing rooms of London would have been fine because they're so dark. But in the strong Sydney sunlight, She wore her new outfit for the first time to church, and she had white pantaloons like you see there underneath. And the strong Sydney sunshine came through the gaps and just illuminated her pantaloons. And everybody, when she stood up to say prayers, everybody behind her, all the soldiers of the Rum Corps, fell about laughing and shouting. And she turned round and did the only thing a lady could do in those circumstances. She fainted. Nothing else. And Bligh turned round, saw the soldiers laughing, saw what was happening, and he ordered them all out of the church, and he roasted them outside. And that was one of the reasons that the revolution happened, the rebellion happened in the end, because the soldiers hated him so much. And that was just one more chink in his armour, really, because of Mary's love of fashion.
Of the pantaloons.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is a muslin gown that, as you can see, is quite sheer. So you definitely want your petticoats underneath it. This is a day dress, and this is a block print that was actually taken from a Regency design. The printing kind of process was coming into fashion, was quite new. It's very, very light. So this would be, even though it is very light, it would have been worn in winter as well, so it would be quite chilly. You can see that there's a lovely gathering at the back as well. This one hasn't got a train. The next one that I'll show you does. Here we go. So if you were wanting to show that you had some wealth, you would have a white gown, because the amount of effort it took to keep it clean showed that you had laundry facilities other than yourself. So this is the white gown. Sorry, it's about crease. It's come from Melbourne. This would have been a day gown as it stood here. But if you didn't have a lot of money, you would have to change up your dress for evening wear. It was actually required that if you were dressing for dinner, that you would do something to your gown in order to make it different. So one of the options was to pin in a long sleeve. So you'd have a long sleeve pinned in, we wouldn't do this for dinner. I'm just going to backtrack slightly. For day wear, you would have a little, well, we call it a chemisette. It wouldn't have been called a chemisette at the time because that's too French, but it's a little filler kind of over the real estate, and then you would unveil the real estate for dinner. Right. Another way of adding a difference, I'll just put that there, is to add a little waistcoat, what they called waistcoat, over the bodice, so that you'd get a different look for the gown. And that way you wouldn't have to have such a large wardrobe, which a lot of the women couldn't afford. Thank you. Now the outerwear, which is some of the more delicious things. I'll just, the Spencer jacket was very much in fashion during the time. A little short jacket. If I can I have a lady's maid, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's really nice, isn't it?
As you can see, the construction at the back, which is very much a Regency construction with the diamond. Gives a bit more movement in the arms. And that would be, as you said, coming up with the Empire line. So it all looked very flowing and very sort of Grecian, which was the idea of the time.
That's a lot of layers, isn't it?
It's all quite comfortable, considering what was coming afterwards. In the Victorian era, it was very comfortable. This is based on the 1995 Elizabeth Bennet jacket. And it took the seamstress quite a while. As you can see, we've got the sliced Renaissance sleeves, or Renaissance sleeves.
You right?
Yep, this is very awkward, so here we go.
Sure.
Oops, here we go. There we go. So there was quite a lot of this kind of slashing through and interest around the shoulder line, things like that. Again, the diamond shapes. So that's that one. Now, moving on to when it gets a little bit colder, you would have your full pelisse, P-E-L-I-S-S-E. There we go. for the winters.
You could wear that today, couldn't you?
Yes.
Is that Turkish red?
And we have the frogged fastenings here because it's a Napoleonic era and there's a lot of military influence on the fashions. So that's the police.
Nice.
Very comfortable. Very comfortable. Now, in terms of ball gown, this is my ball gown. It's probably a little bit later than the era that I write in 1812, and this has got some detail on the bottom of the gown, which makes it probably a little bit later, coming into about 1816 to 1818. Again, you'll see that there's a lot of slashing and things like that. So this is silk. It looks not so dynamic at the moment because it's flattened it, but it's really quite a lovely gown to wear, lots of swish, and it's been danced in at a Guildhall dance at Bath, where they had a costumed ball. My husband got dressed as well, bless him. And it was as close to a ball as we could get, and it was just a wonderful time. So that's a ball gown from that time. And finally,
I could get a job doing this.
Thank you. I told you that my mother is a master embroiderer, and so she's made me some reticules. These are the small little bags or purses that were used at the time. As you can see, the gorgeous little embroidery there. I went down a rabbit hole when I was researching what would happen when a lady went to a ball. Where would she put her reticule? Would she carry it? Would she put it in the room set aside with the maids in case you got a rip in your gown? What would happen to it? And I spent hours researching this. And I finally went to an expert. I said, well, what happened? And they said, we don't know. And I thought, I can do what I want. So that was very helpful for my plot. But yeah, so that's one of the reticules that she's made, and another. So I'm very lucky there. And of course, you'd have your clocked silk stockings. These have got elastic in them, so not quite excellent. And finally, or not quite finally, but this is one of the shawls. A lot of shawls came from India, East India Company things. So we'd have that. Another layer. People often wore shawls around the house as well because it was so cold. Knitted shawls. This would be a fancy one for a ball. And I told you I don't sew, but I did make a bonnet. It took me ages and I had to pull it out twice. But I'm very proud of it, so you're going to see it. Here we go.
Lovely.
Thank you.
So there are so many things to still talk about, I think, but what we'd like to do is open up for some questions from everyone who's heard you speak this evening. And so there'll be roving microphones. So if you've got a question, just raise your hand and someone will come and give you the microphone. Particularly important because we have people online.
Oh, thanks, Kate, yes. Good.
Thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating, so thank you. One of the things that I have encountered from time to time when you read historical fiction is people having emotions or that you don't think really gel with the period, or people using language from which wouldn't have been used at the time as well. And I'm just wondering how, when you're trying to convey how people think or how people speak, how you manage that. I've often thought that a good editor would have said, no way, you can't have that word or that expression in literature set in this era, but I'm wondering how you manage it and whether you've had editors who've said that doesn't ring true, to a reader.
No, it's kind of I suppose probably 20 years ago, it was quite fashionable to write in very old English, in an old English way that your characters might have spoken. But now it's much more fashionable to write in contemporary English, so it's a way that readers would really understand and completely, they'd be able to read it very, very easily. But you're absolutely right about the words. You should never use words that weren't in use at that time. And I think we're all spending a lot of time looking at dictionaries to make sure when a word came into fashion, and we never... So yes, you're right, an editor should always let the writer know if they've, said the word bullshit, and bullshit was never obviously used at that point. So you never use words that weren't around then, or you should never, but you do tend to use language and the conversation and kind of the informality that we use today, because the idea is that readers can relate to that and they can read it very easily. I mean, we've had Peter Carey write the Ned Kelly book in old English, and that was really hard for a lot of people, and they don't really believe that should be done anymore.
Well, yeah, it is about accessibility for the reader, but the way that I approached it was that I built in that sense of that time through the syntax. So instead of using that kind of long run-on sentence that kind of is now so alien to us after Hemingway, that building in that kind of syntax of that time helps to create that flavour, but doesn't create a kind of block to the reader. But also, you do have to be very careful, because one of the things that I need to be careful about is that there are so many words to do and built around locomotion, and trains hadn't been invented at that point. So all the words around timekeeping and speed are often around locomotion. So those are the words that I am constantly thinking, where does that come from? How do they tell time? How is time felt when we didn't have that kind of locomotion anchor? So you have to be very, very careful. And I am constantly looking at the Dictionary of Etymology. And 1816, can't use it, because I'm in 1812. And occasionally I've tried to sneak something through that's 1819, and my editor goes, no. Okay.
We have a question from right up the back here.
I guess it's slightly related to the last answer. I'm wondering how much attention you pay to what the audience of your books might appreciate or want do you sort of think, I'll put that bit in because it'll go really well with the book clubs?
I think you write to please yourself, really, and you kind of think, if I'm entertained and I'm really interested in this thing, then maybe readers will be as well. But if you start trying to second-guess readers, it's really, really hard, because some readers will like some things. It's an impossible task. So I always think, what really interests me, will this really spark my imagination? And that's all you can do, I think, really. You can't really, otherwise we'd all be bestsellers around the world constantly, because we'll be able to predict exactly what our readers would like.
Well, I was very lucky to study with Gerald Murnane, and he always said, follow your obsessions. Because if you're obsessed by it, someone else will be. And so I always think about it. I think about, what is interesting me, just like you, what is interesting me? I am writing a book which is about female freedom and coming to self, and that's what interests me, and all those things around that. So, that it happens to be a good book to have a glass of wine, fabulous. But I didn't write it like that.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Yes, just over here.
Hi, thanks very much. Absolutely fascinating. On the subject of editing, I can't help noticing that the Ladies' Road Guide hasn't got a an apostrophe after ladies. Is that an editor's decision? Or?
It was because it's one of the guides that they used to have rather than particular ladies. So it's the ladies as in all of the ladies guide. It's following the convention of the time.
A guide to being ladies.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you for noticing.
I'm so sorry to have to break this up. It's been a treat in all ways. When we devised this program, the events subcommittee of the Friends, we did have at the back of our heads the bicentenary celebrations of the birth of Jane Austen, whose novels were written and set at exactly this time. And this year there's been, as we know, huge and well-deserved attention to her work and her life. But we thought this would be a prompt to cast a wider net and to reflect on some other women of the period, real and imagined. And it's been fantastic. So the connection has been superb. So thank you all so much from all of us. We are grateful that you've come here, you've given the thought and the time, you've talked to one another and to us so carefully and thoughtfully. And Kate, thanks so much also for your thoughtful and gracious moderating of the conversation. Would you please all thank our three speakers. Now, we've had one wonderful surprise. We loved the dressing up. And I kept on thinking about the clothes that Mary Bligh was wearing and how scandalous she was. So I could see all of that happening. And then I was wondering a little bit about how Anne Inett got on. She was a seamstress, but she didn't have all of those fabrics. But before we do wind up, there's one more thing, and that is a Lucky Door prize. There's a very tiny book that was kindly donated by Alison, along with a gift from the Friends ourselves. And Belinda has told me that the winner of the Lucky Door prize is Rill Hurley. So, Rill, whom I know as it happens, can you kindly make yourself known to a member of the library staff as you leave? And that is that. As I said at the start, the bookshop is open until 7:30, and Alison and Sue are now going to be going up to the foyer where they will be very happy to sign copies of the books. Thank you all for coming.